It's a lot to talk about today. First of all, let me briefly introduce myself for those that haven't joined me before. My name is Joel Mayer. I'm an educator and a tour guide in Israel. I'm currently in Israel as I speak to you right now. I don't speak on behalf, especially since today we're speaking about a topic with many narratives, perspectives, and ideas, and people coming from very different positions. I don't speak on behalf of anyone else but myself. And it's important for me to say that as much as I can, I will let you know when I'm giving opinion, when I'm giving something that I believe to be factual, and try not to conflate the two, which is something that happens so very much with regards to the subject that we're speaking about. I can't promise, as I mentioned, I'm a Jewish Israeli. I live in Israel. I certainly have my background, my perspective, and the world that I'm immersed within. I certainly can't promise to be completely objective. And I think that nobody is completely objective. In fact, anyone that tells you that they know the truth, that they know what's going on, that they are objective, is not only wrong, but more than likely deliberately trying to obfuscate or try and distort what's really going on, and perhaps it's part of the problem. So what I'm going to try and do is to present to you today, and the way that we're going to do things, if that's okay, is a number of you have been asking me many questions in the lead up to the session. So what I've done is chosen a few topics which I'm going to focus on. And after that, we'll open it up for questions. My aim is in 1 hour and 15 minutes to deal with the subjects that I've decided to speak about. And after 1 hour and 15 minutes, for those that would like to continue on for further questions, are free to do so. You're obviously free to come and go whenever you like. But I think it's appropriate to say that we'll set a fixed time for the session that we're going to run. And after that, I will be remaining online for as long as anyone would like to continue to ask and discuss questions. I have everybody muted. For those that join me for the virtual tours during COVID, we were very used to having microphones open at the beginning. Because of the nature of the topic that we're speaking about, I felt that it's more appropriate to have the microphones closed. Again, people coming from very different perspectives. Can I just ask you in the chat, someone wrote that they're unable to hear me. So can someone just give me a quick wave? I can see Barbara is waving and saying she can hear me. Okay, so I think we're okay. In any case, the microphones are closed. If you would like to ask questions, so what we'll do is you're welcome to put questions in the chat as we're going along. If I can ask you not to clog the chat up with comments that are not questions. And that way, as we move to, if I see a clarification question that comes up on the chat, I will endeavor to answer it on the way. Otherwise, I'll be able to go back through the chat and to answer as many of the questions that you think about at the end. So feel free to put comments in the chat as we go along. And it's also, if you want to note them down to yourselves, and then we can raise them at the end as well. But I will really appreciate to respect each other in terms of putting only questions in the chat and not expressing opinions in the chat, so to speak, if that's okay. Please do feel free to speak to each other. I know many of us know each other, which is wonderful. So please feel free to switch to gallery view and send a message privately if you'd like to chat with anyone. So I hope that's okay. And we're going to get going. So I'm going to begin by giving a little bit of a synopsis of what is the current situation in Gaza. I would imagine that 100 days in, that we all have a vague idea of exactly where it is that we're speaking about. So I'm going to try not to go right back to the very beginning and explain the roots and the origins of the conflict, so to speak, but to speak in more general terms. And again, if there's any questions or anything is unclear, then please feel free to ask. I don't have all the answers, but I'll certainly try and touch on as much as possible. So first of all, what's going on in Israel and Gaza? So I'll begin with the current situation on the ground in Gaza. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, which is Hamas run, there are over 23,000 Palestinians who have been killed in the conflict over the last 100 days. The average age in Gaza, the mean age in the Gaza Strip is around 18 or 19 years of age, and a significant number of those, again, taking at face value that the numbers of the Gaza Health Ministry being accurate, that a significant number of those, at least half of those, are women and children. Again, how we define children, combatants, non-combatants, I'm not going to go into now, but to give you some kind of idea of numbers, approximately 1% of, according to these figures, approximately 1% of the population of the Gaza Strip, 2.3 million, have been killed in the conflict that is going on over the last 100 days. According to the IDF, 9,000 terrorists have been killed. Again, members of the Hamas, PFLP, Islamic Jihad, those that have been combatants, according to the IDF. And again, that would, again, we're going to be speaking today about narrative, is that on the one hand, 23,000 is an absolutely enormous number of people, which is, it's difficult, it's heartbreaking, and it's terrible. 9,000 terrorists is a significant number, which according to, again, taking both the IDF and the Hamas Gaza Health Ministry at face value, these figures, if both of these were taken into account, would suggest that there is approximately 1 in 3 or just under 1 in 3 ratio between combatants and non-combatants. So again, we'll speak more about the narratives and so on later on, but it's interesting to note that on the one hand, this is an incredibly large number of people that have been killed, Palestinians that have been killed in the conflict. Corresponding to that, we also see that the combatant non-combatant ratio, according to these numbers, is very, very low in comparison with all other global conflicts. So it's interesting to look at the way that we look at the different information. Again, from the IDF, 188 soldiers have been killed on the ground in Gaza, and 132 hostages, predominantly Israelis and also internationals who were in Israel on October the 7th, kidnapped, are still being held in Gaza. Some of those are understood to have passed away. Around 25 of those 132, we understand, have already been killed or passed away in this time. According to Al Jazeera, Abu Ubaidah, so one of the main figures within the Hamas in Gaza, has also suggested that the Hamas themselves don't necessarily know where all of the hostages are. So very, very difficult situation. I mentioned before 2.3 million people living in the Gaza Strip. Around 1.8 million of those have been internally displaced. So the Palestinians of Gaza remaining inside Gaza, but around 80 to 85% of those have been internally displaced. Earlier on in the conflict, the population of northern Gaza was asked, requested, demanded, again, depending on the different perspectives, to move from the north of Gaza to the southern section of Gaza beyond the Gaza River. And so a significant portion of the population of Gaza moved to the south, and there's very little population relatively in the north of Gaza. And within the south of Gaza, which is where most of the ground operations are now going on, there are also those within southern Gaza who've been displaced, including those that moved from the north. So the majority of the people in Gaza today are now in the areas of Rafah and Khan Yunis. So if you're hearing on the news or you're following along where many of the major battles are taking place, most of them in the area of Rafah and Khan Yunis. And these are areas with a very, very dense, a very, very high population density, because these are areas of the south of Gaza where many of the people in the north moved across to. Of course, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is very, very grave. Prior to October the 7th, around 500 trucks a day were moving into Gaza. Over the period of the temporary ceasefire, when there was a negotiated hostage release, around 200 trucks were coming in. Now just over 100 trucks or so of aid are coming into the Strip on a daily basis. Israel has opened crossing directly from Israel. And again, very difficult to speak about this subject without comparing or contrasting narratives. The United Nations is suggesting that Israel is delaying the ability of international organizations, including the United Nations, to bring aid into the Gaza Strip. And Israel is suggesting that it's facilitating the entry of aid into the Strip, and that it's actually the United Nations that is struggling to keep up with the demand, so to speak, or to properly facilitate the aid moving in. I should also add that there is a significant amount of aid that is being stolen by the Hamas. inside Gaza, which has been documented both by the IDF, but also video and Palestinian testimony as well. So it's a very difficult situation, also muddied by the fact that the leadership within Gaza, the Hamas, are also, in their own words, not responsible for the welfare of the people, of the Palestinians, the people of the Gaza Strip, something that they themselves have mentioned on video in interviews. Where is the Hamas leadership? So when we're speaking about the Hamas leadership inside Gaza, and later on we'll speak about the fact that Hamas leadership are both inside and outside Gaza. Inside Gaza, we've mentioned before, Abu Ubaidah, also mentioned before Mohammed Sinwar, who's the leader of Hamas inside Gaza. Both of them are believed to be in the area of Khan Yunis, in tunnels underneath the civilian population, and are very much below ground. There have been suggestions, although again this is unverified, that Israel is aware of the whereabouts of the senior leadership of the Hamas, but has not been able to strike due to the proximity of Israeli hostages in the area of the leadership. Whether that's true or not is yet to be verified, as is much of the information that we're speaking about here. Even when we're speaking about numbers of terrorists, the number of dead inside Gaza, these are numbers that are not verified independently beyond both the Hamas and IDF, for example. This is the situation. Fighting is going on a daily basis. Even as we speak today, rockets have been fired into Israel from the Gaza Strip. As of now, approximately 11,000 rockets have been fired in the last 100 days into Israel from the Gaza Strip. I was asked the question, why do I call Hamas the Hamas? I think it's a translation probably from Hebrew, Hamas. Hamas is the Islamic resistance movement, so the Islamic resistance movement, but it's semantic. But Hamas, the Hamas, speaking about the same thing. In terms of ceasefire, which is something very much on the words, I know that many of you are aware in the countries that you live in, people out on the streets speaking about the demand and calls for a ceasefire. The Israeli perspective is that a ceasefire is not something that is possible to countenance without Israeli hostages all being returned and a removal of the security threat to Israeli citizens. The Hamas, or Hamas rather, have intimated at this stage, and we'll speak more about who are those negotiating on behalf of Hamas, that a ceasefire is also not on the table, a temporary ceasefire. There needs to be a full ceasefire in order to then go about speaking about returning the hostages. So right now, both Israel and Hamas neither are seriously contemplating a ceasefire at the moment, and we can speak about what are the aims on both sides. I was asked a question about clarifying the ratio of combatants and civilians in Gaza. So again, just to clarify, taking the number of between 23 and 24,000, according to the Hamas Gaza Health Ministry, of Palestinians dying, which is an incredibly large number, and according to the IDF, 9,000 combatants, Palestinian terror combatants, have been killed. Again, if we take that number 9,000, 9 times 3, 27,000. So we're looking at approximately 2 Palestinian civilians killed, or just under 2 Palestinian civilians killed for every 1 Palestinian combatant, which on the one hand is a terrible thing, that any civilians are dying that are not combatants. If we look at that in comparison to other wars waged since, I think figures are on the table since the 1980s in modern warfare, then almost no modern warfare drops below 1 to 5 in terms of 5 civilians killed for every combatant. So the number of civilians being killed, according to the numbers supplied by Hamas and the IDF, the number of civilians killed is very, very large. According to comparisons to other warfare on the ground, in other conflicts, the number of civilians killed in comparison to the number of combatants killed is very, very low. It's not to suggest that the situation is good and couldn't be improved upon, but this is the situation. Also bearing in mind that the fighting is taking place in very, very close combat, house to house. And again, the Hamas and Jihad are fighters that are not uniformed. It actually makes the expectation that there will be a higher number, even higher number of civilian civilian deaths over combatants. The reality appears to be a little different. So this is the situation on the ground. I'm going to say a few words about the situation in Palestinian politics, because if we're trying to understand, I mentioned before, and many of you have been asking me about what will happen the day after, if we can use that term, the day after. We need to understand what's going on in the Palestinian political situation. So first of all, we understand that prior to October the 7th, Hamas were in sole control of the Gaza Strip. That following the elections in 2006, where we had the Hamas take a significant portion of the previous Palestinian elections, the last time they took place in 2006. In 2007, the Hamas kicked the Fatah, which is the other major political faction in the Palestinian society, out of Gaza. And since 2007, we have complete separation in terms of political control, the Hamas in control of the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinian National Authority or Palestinian Authority, the areas controlled by the Palestinians in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority has been dominated by Fatah. So, for example, Mohammed Shtaya, who's the Palestinian Prime Minister, or Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, who's the Palestinian President, they are both from the Fatah faction. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is an organization that is made up of different political factions. It's confusing. In any case, in very, very simple terms, the Palestinian Authority is dominated by Fatah, controlling the West Bank, and Hamas controlling the Gaza Strip. Since October the 7th, the Palestinian Authority, Prime Minister and President, have stopped short of outright condemning Hamas. And also of outright condemning unreservedly the acts of Hamas on October the 7th inside Israel. We need to try and understand also why that could be, beyond narrowly looking ideologically at perhaps any sympathy or empathy with the actions taken by Hamas. I mentioned before that Fatah are the major controlling power within the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Fatah are deeply, deeply unpopular in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. If I just for a moment screen share with you, again, this is Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. If I just screen share with you, let's just go share screen and show you. First of all, here we go. Hope you're able to see that. In December, there was a major study that was created by Khalil Shikaki, who's the preeminent pollster in the Palestinian society. And one of the questions that was asked is, if new elections were to be held today, Mahmoud Abbas, who's the president, who is next to me here on the screen, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and the Fatah movement, was to run against Ismail Haniyeh, who is the chair of the political bureau of Hamas. He's currently in Qatar. That if they were going to run for presidency, what would the results be? And you can see very clearly that even before October the 7th, you can see that the Fatah were deeply unpopular, the party in control of the Palestinian Authority. You can also see that following October the 7th, that Fatah have become less popular. You can see that actually in the West Bank, 82% of people, I believe, if we look at the numbers, let's try and, again, if you see the blue that you're looking at is how many people would vote for Mahmoud Abbas, who's the current president and in control of the Palestinian Authority. The orange is who would vote for the Hamas candidate, Ismail Haniyeh. And you can see, for example, that in the West Bank, prior to October the 7th, 50% of Palestinians in the West Bank, according to the poll, of those who would go to vote, suggested they would vote for Hamas. That jumped to 82%. So as of the most recent poll, 82% of Palestinians polled in the West Bank would vote for Hamas, would vote for Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas over Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas. You can see actually the numbers have also gone up in the Gaza Strip, but less than in the West Bank. There's more support for Hamas in the West Bank than there is in than there is in the Gaza Strip. And this is the situation, politically, just to have some kind of understanding of the Palestinians. So we have the Fatah, which is in control in the West Bank, but are deeply, deeply unpopular. And Hamas popular, and the Hamas popularity is very, very high. Just to try and understand this. And at the same time, the Hamas are seen essentially as having given a bloody nose to Israel, having a significant achievement in what took place on October the 7th. The Fatah, the party of the main party in the Palestinian Authority, are seen as corrupt. They're seen to be working in coordination with the Israeli security forces. So they're seen as being in cahoots with Israel, who are seen as an occupying power by many Palestinians. So we understand that the Palestinian Authority is in a very difficult situation, because on the one hand, if it were to condemn Hamas, that would strengthen its position as perhaps being seen as a potential replacement for the Hamas internationally in whatever will happen in Gaza post the current situation. On the other hand, by outright condemning Hamas or condemning the actions of Hamas, it would make the Palestinian Authority even less popular compared to Hamas. The flip side is that if the Palestinian Authority will not be supported by Israel, then it appears that the Hamas will very quickly be able to garner major, not only political, but also military control inside the West Bank as well. So the situation in the Palestinian Authority is very, very perilous in terms of maintaining control. For those that joined me in 2021, we were speaking about fighting between Israel and Hamas, Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza in 2021, and rockets being fired following the cancellation of the Palestinian elections in 2021. And some of you may remember that one of the things that we spoke about is that when the Palestinian elections were cancelled in 2021, it was painted as something that was to be condemned, that Israel were to be condemned for not allowing Palestinians to have an election. The reality, which is an open secret in the West Bank particularly, is that the best thing that could have happened for Fatah, for the Palestinian Authority, and Mahmoud Abbas, who's here next to me, is that those elections were cancelled, because if the elections had taken place, then he would no longer be president and Hamas would have seized control in 2021. So this is the situation between the Fatah and the Hamas, very problematic. At the same time, I should also mention something that is not hugely understood or known about outside, is what is the situation of the Hamas themselves. So when we're speaking about the Hamas, I mentioned before Sinwar, who is the leader of the Hamas inside Gaza. I mentioned also before Abu Ubaidah as well. So this is the leadership that we know of inside Gaza. We also understand that the head, I mentioned before, Ismail Haniyeh, who used to be the former leader inside Gaza, he's now the head of the political bureau of Hamas. Hamas also have representatives outside of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in other places in the world. And much of the leadership is in Qatar. So Khaled Mashal, who was once the leader of the Hamas, he's now perhaps akin to a foreign minister, but a senior member of Hamas, and Ismail Haniyeh are both in Qatar. So when we're speaking about negotiations, so Qatar as a negotiator between Israel and the Hamas, predominantly we're speaking about negotiations between the Hamas leadership in Qatar, which is not the same as the Hamas leadership inside Gaza. Just to understand, we're now starting to understand that it's likely that whilst the Hamas leadership in Qatar understood and would have known about the plans for the event that took place on October the 7th, the decision to launch the strike specifically on October the 7th was something that was taken by the leadership in Gaza and not necessarily known about by the leadership in Qatar. So we're starting to understand that there is a disconnect and anger and resentment, not necessarily aligning up both personally and politically of opinions and views between the two leaderships. The leadership in Qatar have been making noises about potentially compromising with Israel, something that is not noises that are coming out of the political leadership and military leadership of the Hamas inside Gaza. So we understand that the Hamas themselves are also not a united front at the same time. It also means that when we're speaking about negotiations, it's unclear whether the Qatar Hamas leadership are able to fulfill any obligations that they will put forward. So a case in point would be, for example, that in the previous temporary ceasefire, when hostages were released, one of the points of the negotiation was that the Red Cross would be allowed access to Israeli hostages inside Gaza, something that on the ground was not allowed to happen by the leadership of Hamas in Gaza. So we understand that the political situation for the Palestinians is very complicated. We should also mention that, and perhaps ever so slightly contradicting myself, that I mentioned before that the elections in 2021 would have potentially seen Hamas take control or be seen as the popular organization inside the West Bank. We're also starting to understand, and again, a lot of this is to an extent conjecture, but for those that have been following on with interviews given, and I've shown some of you the interviews in previous sessions, that one of the interviews that was given very clearly by the Hamas leadership was essentially that the Hamas leadership are not responsible for the Palestinians in Gaza. I mentioned that also earlier on, that the responsibility is that the UNRWA, United Nations Work and Relief Agency, dealing with Palestinian refugees, should be dealing with all of the Palestinian refugees, which is around 80% of the Palestinian population of Gaza, are defined as refugees by the United Nations. And again, we can speak more about that a little later on. And on the one hand, Hamas gets an awful lot of money through taxation raised by ruling, the mundane bureaucratic ruling of the Gaza Strip. At the same time, it's not necessarily interested in the bureaucratic ruling of the Gaza Strip. That's not part of the original ethos of the Hamas prior to it becoming a political force in the early 2000s. And so there are some suggestions that one of the questions that was asked is, why would Hamas have launched the attack on October the 7th when they would have known that a reaction by Israel would be as grave as it has been, with the view to destroying the ability of Hamas to rule in the Gaza Strip? But the answers is possible is that Hamas may not actually be as interested in ruling politically as perhaps we and many people would have actually thought. If we look at Hezbollah, we'll speak about more a little bit later on, that Hezbollah in Lebanon are an example of a very, very powerful military and political force. They play a political role within the government of Lebanon. They're a very powerful military force inside Lebanon, but they are not responsible for the rule of Lebanon and can therefore place responsibility for what happens to the Lebanese civilians on others. It's possible that this is also part of the view of Hamas, that Hamas are looking for a way to maintain themselves as a military force, but no longer be ultimately responsible for the rule of all Palestinians, whether that be in Gaza or the West Bank. Let's speak, and I can see there's a lot of questions flying up, so I'll try and come to them and seeing some of them are not necessarily related to what we're speaking about. Okay, very quickly. I was asked to cite the source of my stats. The stats that I gave were from a report that was created in December by a Palestinian political scientist based in Ramallah. His name is Khalil Shikaki. You can look him up online. I have the entire report. If you're interested, I'll be able later on to share that with you. Very, very interesting. He's, I would suggest, the most by far the most reliable source of statistics on what's going on in Palestinian society. Khalil Shikaki is his name. One of the questions is, how has he managed to be polling people inside Gaza with everything going on? It's a question. Again, the methodology is based on use of doing things online. How accurate it can be, we can ask the question. Nonetheless, it's the only study that we have. Let's speak a little bit about Israeli political situation. Over the course of today, we've marked 100 days since October the 7th and 100 days that hostages have been inside Gaza. We mentioned 132 hostages who are still being held inside Gaza. For the last 24 hours, we've had the families of the hostages have been holding a rally in what's called Hostages Square outside the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, has now become known as the Hostages Square. There's been a rally. Well over 100,000 people have been. These are pictures from yesterday evening. They've also, inside the square, perhaps I can show you here, built it's a little difficult to see, but what you're looking at here is a mock tunnel that it's possible to walk through to try and invoke and try and understand or show Israeli people what will the people that are still being held inside Gaza going through. So the hostage families have been a very, very big voice in Israeli society. Anyone following on in the Hebrew language press will see that there's an awful lot of I don't want to use the word disparagingly, but a lot of noise, a lot of trying to make as much impact as possible on the government of Israel, the hostages' families. Interestingly, we can see this going in two different ways. There are voices, for example, there were voices today, for example, calls for by one of the hostage families, a family of one of the two Bedouin family members who are being held in Gaza, Muslim Bedouin Israelis from the south of Israel. And again, a prominent voice suggesting that Israel should find a way to halt the fighting in order to bring back as many hostages as possible. On the other hand, we've also had hostage families who have been going to the Kerem Shalom. I mentioned that Israel has opened a direct aid gateway into the Gaza Strip directly from Israel. We've also had families who have been symbolically trying to show that their opposition on preventing aid from going into the Gaza Strip, suggesting why should Israel be emboldening an enemy or supporting Gaza and Palestinians when Israelis are still being held as hostages inside. So there are different opinions even amongst the hostage families. Nonetheless, this idea of frustration that either the government is not doing enough in order to bring the hostages back or isn't doing enough in order to take control of the Gaza Strip in order to bring them back, whichever perspective that one is looking at, it hints at very deep unpopularity of both Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, and also the government of Israel as well. There are huge recriminations over, in Hebrew, say hafkir, to abandon or to fail to take responsibility for the people living in the south, that they were told that they were safe and secure and being looked after, and essentially that they were abandoned, that the military and the country was not ready in order to protect them in their hour of need. This is something that is very, very, very major. A number of polls that have been conducted by different Israeli newspapers are suggesting that if elections, and it's a moot point because elections are not going to be taking place in the near future, as it seems, but if elections were to take place, that Benjamin Netanyahu would be very, very unpopular, that Benny Gantz, who was another senior politician who, together with Gadi Eisenkot and Benjamin Netanyahu, are the three active members of the war cabinet, that Benny Gantz would be significantly, who's in a more centrist National Union party, would have a much larger poll than Benjamin Netanyahu, and that the parties of the previous coalition, if you remember the parties of the Otzma Yehudit, Shas, the Likud, the parties formed a very right of center bloc, that they would no longer be able to gain a majority in the way that they did in the elections before October the 7th. So significant changes in the political landscape. Whether that will still be the same when elections will take place, of course, is another moot point. Should also mention that there are divisions within the war cabinet. So just as an example, just over here, I don't know if you can see, this is Benny Gantz that I spoke about before. This was yesterday evening. So Gantz and Eisenkot, for example, made their way and stood amongst those that were in Hostages Square at the rally and were standing in and amongst them. Benjamin Netanyahu was not standing in and amongst them. So there are divisions in terms of how they're perceived by the public. There are also divisions because Benjamin Netanyahu, and I won't go too deeply into it, that the Prime Minister Netanyahu, in order to maintain power and for elections not to take place, needs to keep other members of his coalition who are outside the war cabinet So people, for example, like Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, names of political figures who are significantly to the right of Benjamin Netanyahu. And in order to keep them within the coalition, needs to a certain extent, stomach or accept certain things that are said, or to try and push back against actions that wish to be taken by other members of the war cabinet. And that causes a certain amount of friction. Just to give you a little bit more of an example, the IDF, and maybe a very concrete example, the IDF has called its intention to begin an inquiry into the events of October the 7th. What took place? What were the failures? How did it happen? How can it be prevented from happening? Members of Netanyahu's cabinet outside the War Council are showing displeasure at this, speaking, for example, about the Internal Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, suggesting that if the IDF is investigating senior officers over what happened on October the 7th, the suggestion is that this will damage the ability of those same officers, those same generals and staff, to be able to focus on the war effort that is taking place right now. The IDF's position is that with the war seemingly not going to end in the near future, it's important to now learn the lessons of October the 7th in order to improve the conduct of the army as the war continues on. And we'll speak shortly about Hezbollah in the north and the fact that it seems increasingly likely that we are going to see an inflaming of the situation between Israel and Hezbollah on Israel's northern border, and therefore any lessons or anything that was, any failures that took place with vis-a-vis Hamas in the south, need to make sure that those same failures won't take place opposite Hezbollah. At the same time, we understand that this is a cause of division within not only within the cabinet, but within the wider government as well. I should also mention, for those that have been following on with Israel's Dover, Israel's speaker of the IDF, Daniel Hagari, that Daniel Hagari has mentioned, he called 2024 the year of war, which again would suggest, and we're even over the course of what happened today, but even before the events of today, which I'll speak about, it seems that a northern front is going to open up, however much we may or may not wish it to do so, with Hezbollah. I should also mention that they are now speaking in the Israeli parliament about the budget, and that the emergency budget is being extended because it's not expected that the war is going, in the words of Benjamin Netanyahu, is going to end anytime soon. So this is the current situation inside Israeli politics and Israeli society as well. Let me speak a little bit about the northern border. I'll just pause for a moment just to check if there's any major questions that I can answer now before moving on. Okay, I was asked the question, how popular was Netanyahu's government before 7th of October and how popular after the 7th of October? It's a very good question. First of all, ultimately, the situation in Israel before the 7th of October and the situation in Israel after the 7th of October are completely and utterly different worlds. Prior to October the 7th, it seemed that it very, very much felt within Israeli society that there was huge polarization, those that were incredibly for the government and those that were incredibly against the government. That those that were for the government particularly for its wish to try and reduce the power of the judiciary, of the Supreme Court, and increase the power of the government, and that because the government coalition was completely to the right of center, that this was an ability to pass things which previously with Israel's coalition system, whenever there are major changes going to take place, we often see governments fall. And because there was a right-wing coalition that were all to an extent having the same perspective vis-a-vis Israel's judiciary and its power as a stop block. In Israeli politics, we don't have a second house or a House of Representatives or a Congress or a House of Lords. And so the block to stop or the limit, the brake on governmental power, for better or worse, is the Supreme Court. So before October the 7th, Benjamin Netanyahu was deeply unpopular, first of all, for pushing this through. And he was deeply unpopular for potentially being seen in for certain corruption, which may or may not have taken place. But he was also incredibly popular by those that saw the corruption claims against him as a political witch hunt, and those that saw it as a way to try and stop this change taking place, where the judiciary would be weakened vis-a-vis the parliament. All of that, to an extent, has been put to the side. Post October the 7th, there are many people that were pro-Netanyahu. The question was how, or pro-Netanyahu and his government, that are having second thoughts. It doesn't necessarily mean that they've moved. They certainly haven't shifted to the left. They haven't necessarily changed their opinions, but they now have reasons to be angry with the government, because whether you're left or right, there is a lot of anger at what has taken place and how Israel was not ready, prepared, or able to deal with the threat and the continuing conduct of the war since October the 7th. So there is a lot more opposition on both sides, whereas prior to October the 7th, there was more opposition only on one side of society, so to speak. Should also mention a couple of things, is that over the last week, we've seen, and I won't go deeply into it now, what seems to be the end of anything to do with a challenge to overruling the ability of the judiciary to call out the parliament or government if it will pass laws that are deemed to be illegal, is seemingly behind us. And I'll speak shortly about the International Court of Justice, that when the South Africans decided to take Israel to the International Court of International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice on genocide charges, the South Africans and Israelis were both given a choice of judge who they could appoint to represent their case. And the judge that was appointed by Israel, so suggested by Ron Dermer, who was within a sort of an advisory role within the war cabinet, and Netanyahu himself, is a judge. His name is Barak, and he was actually a judge that was seen prior to October the 7th as the person who was responsible for the overuse of judicial power. And yet when it came to the crunch, that was the judge that was chosen to represent Israel at the International Criminal Court. So very interesting changes have taken place. I'm going to move on to the northern border. And then we'll come back to it. People asking questions about Hamas and Fatah, but we'll leave that for a little bit later on. Let's come to the northern border. If I show you very briefly, let's show you just a little map over here. That you can see here that we've been speaking about Gaza over here, West Bank over here, and this is Israel's northern border with Syria and with Lebanon. And if we zoom in, 42 Israeli towns and villages have been evacuated from this area. Officially, 85,000 people have been evacuated from these areas. The actual number is significantly higher. The 85,000 refers to those who have been supported financially to an extent in moving away and helping them find somewhere else to be. There are many others feeling unsafe. So well over 100,000 people have moved away, are now permanently not living in this area. Altogether in Israel, there are over 200,000 internal refugees in Israel's south and in Israel's north. And inside, controlling this area of the south of Lebanon, is the Hezbollah organization. I won't speak now about the foundations of the Hezbollah, but essentially Hezbollah are a Shiite Islamic organization, both militant terror and political, based inside Lebanon. They came into being in 1982. They became much more powerful in the year 2000 after Israel had a very thin line or layer of military forces inside Lebanon that were removed in the year 2000. And Hezbollah today have one of the largest military forces in the Middle East, despite being a non-state actor. They play a prominent role within Lebanese politics, but they're also an independent military and political organization. They control huge swathes of southern Lebanon. Should show you just very quickly, I can show you another map, maybe a little bit further in, that in the Second Lebanon War of 2006, at the end of the Second Lebanon War in 2006, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 stipulated that the area between the Litani River and the blue line, which is the internationally recognized border between Israel and Lebanon, needs to be a demilitarized area. The reality is that that was never enforced, not by the United Nations and not by anybody else. And essentially, Hezbollah control very much the entire area up to Israel's border. Following October the 7th, we had a number of cross-border incursions and attacks and anti-tank rocket mortar attacks from Lebanon, but not by the Lebanese specifically, but by Hezbollah, also by Hamas, because there are also Hamas inside Lebanon as well. If you're confused, don't worry. It's not difficult to be confused. There's significant Palestinian populations also inside Lebanon. The Palestinian population in Lebanon until today do not have citizenship of Lebanon, many of them refugees and children of children of children of refugees since 1948. And so Hamas have strong presence inside Lebanon as well, and to an extent acting at the acquiescence of Hezbollah. At this point, despite Hamas being Sunni Muslim, there are divides within the Islamic world, and the Hezbollah being Shiite, because Hezbollah was seen as the victors in pushing Israel out of Lebanon in 2000, Hezbollah has a degree of support amongst others inside Lebanon who are against Israel and see Hezbollah as a strong bulwark against Israel. So there is also support by, for example, Druze and Sunni and different Christian denominations, some inside Lebanon for Hezbollah. And at the same time, there is a connection of interests between Hezbollah and Hamas, who may not agree ideologically on everything, and also ideologically, theologically as Sunni and Shia, but they have a convergence of interests, a common enemy, which is Israel. And we can also bring Iran into this as well. So the situation on the northern border, that over the last couple of weeks, we've seen a considerable escalation. So we have Israel essentially reacting to an extent to the Hezbollah firing across into Israel. But over the last couple of weeks, we've seen further steps being taken by Israel. So for example, Salah al-Aruri, who is a senior Hamas member, was assassinated by Israel inside Lebanon. And not only inside Lebanon, but in the Dahiyah neighborhood, which is a neighborhood in the south of Beirut, which is seen as a Hezbollah stronghold. So this is a very major statement that not just that a senior Hamas member has been assassinated inside Lebanon, but that it has been done in an area that it's likely that he felt a certain amount of confidence to be able to walk around or be out in the open, since it's an area that is very much controlled by Hezbollah. Also, on the eve of the funeral, Wissam Tawil, who is senior member of the Radwan forces, the naval commando forces of Hezbollah, was also assassinated as well. So Hezbollah have stated very clearly that they are not going to take it lying down. The Iranians likewise also. Overnight, we had four armed men infiltrating from Lebanon into Israel in the area of Hardov, this area over here, who were all killed. So we have a situation where things are very much heating up. And actually, over the last few hours, we had an anti-tank missile hit an Israeli village, and a mother and son were killed in their home inside the village. So again, it's seemingly that things are heating up. We understand, and we'll speak more about the United Nations and the United States, that there are efforts to try, particularly by the Americans, to stop a second front opening up on Israel's northern border. At the same time, I mentioned before,
over 85,000 Israelis, and that's the conservative figure, have left their homes. 42 Israeli towns and villages have nobody living, essentially no one living in them except a small number of people staying behind to defend those towns against Hezbollah attacks. And from an Israeli perspective, and I think in a broad Israeli perspective, the idea that people either will not be able to go back to their homes and live in the north of Israel, or will be expected to go back to their homes without Hezbollah pushed back to at least beyond the Litani River, so they will not be able to directly threaten the people living alongside Israel's border, is not necessarily something that the Israeli government, or I would suggest any reasonable government, would be able to accept. How that will calm down, whether some kind of agreement will be reached with Hezbollah or not, we don't know. But at the moment, it does seem very likely that that if we're speaking about the fighting continuing on significantly into 2024, I would imagine that it's very, very likely that our shift will be up into this area. And just bear in mind that the Hezbollah are far more well-trained. They have a much larger fighting force, that the terrain in Gaza is relatively flat. The terrain in southern Lebanon is hilly and very difficult to fight in, as Israeli soldiers have found in the past, last in 2006. And the technological ability of Hezbollah is also on another level to Hamas. So it's a very formidable enemy for Israel here in this area. One of the questions is, why has Hezbollah not attacked already? And again, here we can zoom out and speak a little bit about Iran. When Hamas launched its attacks on October the 7th and called it the Al-Aqsa Flood, essentially a campaign on behalf of Jerusalem, or the holy mosques, the Holy Mosque of Jerusalem, the hope is that there would be a significant involvement from other Muslim countries or Muslim organizations that would get involved. At the moment, up until now, Hezbollah's position is that it will give a certain amount of support, but it will fight only on its own terms. And we'll speak shortly about the Houthis. At the moment, the only organization really to have joined in the way that perhaps was expected, the Houthis of Yemen, a significant distance away. Let's move on a little bit more, and then we'll open it up to questions. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the international arena, and then we can really open it up to a lot more questions. And I hope it's been useful so far. First of all, let's talk about the Americans. Antony Blinken, the United States Secretary of State, has been visiting a number of countries across the region. He's visited Israel. He's visited Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen in the Palestinian Authority. He's been visiting in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Egypt, and also visiting and speaking with the Gulf leaders as well, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and essentially seeking to garner support for, first of all, for Arab involvement in whatever will be in Gaza post-war, to try and have more involvement for them post-war. Second of all, to try and limit the conflict to being a localized conflict between Israel and the Hamas in Gaza, and for things not to inflame any further on Israel's northern border, the border with Lebanon. At the same time, one of the other things that Blinken has been working on, and one of the things that has been putting out, and brings him to an extent into friction with the Israeli government, is this idea that the Arab states will only get involved on the ground and the huge investment inside Gaza if Israel will work together with the international community to strengthen the Palestinian Authority with a view to Palestinian self-rule and autonomy, essentially paving a path to a two-state solution. At the moment, that is something that the current Israeli government is not speaking about. Again, does that mean that a two-state solution will be permanently off the table? Not necessarily, because governments come and go inside Israel, and as we spoke about before, the current government of Israel is deeply unpopular, and its opposition to a two-state solution, even by those who are more moderate, is based on the current Palestinian leadership. The idea that the Palestinian Authority is seen as the most moderate, yet it has very little clout amongst Palestinians, and will it be able to rule effectively? And the fact that the Palestinian Authority, despite being more moderate, has, for example, Mohammed Shtayyeh, the Palestinian Prime Minister, even over the last few weeks, has come out and said that Hamas is very much part of the Palestinian society and that any solution has to involve Hamas. So on the one hand, there seems a certain amount of justification for Israel to be saying it's not possible to have a two-state solution with the current political leadership. At the same time, Israel's current political leadership isn't in a place to be able to discuss two-state solutions. We'll also say that, and again, and I'll throw my cards on the table, someone, and me personally, someone who has traditionally always advocated for a two-state solution, that looking at what has happened, especially since October the 7th, and the questions over in terms of looking at on a scale, that the more autonomous the Palestinians are, the more of a security threat there is to Israel. The less security threat there is to Israel, the lower the amount of autonomy for the Palestinians. So for example, a Palestinian state that is demilitarized is a safer state for Israelis to live alongside. But a Palestinian state without a military, it could be argued, is not fully sovereign and independent. The same would go for a seaport or an airport and so on and so forth. So finding a way for Palestinians to have autonomy whilst, and again, Israel's security paradigm prior to October the 7th has been to keep tensions on a low level and living with a certain amount of tension. This security paradigm has been utterly and completely obliterated. And so any solution that Israel will agree to, it seems, whether it's this government or even a government further to the left, will need concrete security guarantees for Israel. So where this puts the position of the Americans and the position of Israel and the Palestinian Authority, we have yet to fully understand. I should mention that both the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and particularly Gallant, who is the security minister in Israel, have stated that they have no wish to resettle the Gaza Strip. They have no wish to reoccupy on a permanent basis the Gaza Strip. That's not to say that there won't be, for a certain period of time, Israeli control until this solution or new solution that we spoke about before regarding Blinken will be brought in. But again, Israel's position very clearly is that official position, it doesn't want to reoccupy and resettle an Israeli population into the Gaza Strip. And this is the situation. I can already hear some of you saying, yes, but what about what Ben Gvir said? And what about Nissim Vatori? And what did various other figures say? And we'll speak about that now, because again, whilst I'm mentioning what members of Israel's war cabinet have been saying regarding what will happen for the Gaza Strip from an Israeli perspective, there are other members of the Israeli parliament who have been making other more forthright and, I would argue, much more problematic statements. And we'll speak about that also in a few moments' time. Just before we do speak about the International Criminal Court, which is what I'm alluding to, we'll say a few words about the Houthis, which I know some people were asking, who are the Houthis and what is going on? So I'm not going to give a huge, enormous lecture now on the history of the Houthis, but what I will say is first of all, I'll quickly bring up a map, because I think this will try and help us understand a little bit more. If you can see this. Well, see this more clearly. So you can see Yemen is over here. We've been speaking up until now about Gaza, Israel, West Bank, Lebanon, which is over here. If you come down the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, okay, and we can see Yemen over here. So it's below, from an Israeli perspective, you just go through Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and you come down here to Yemen. This is the area that we're speaking about, and the Houthis. Let's say a few words about the Houthis. So first of all, who are they? So they're named after Hussein al-Houthi, who was the former leader of the organization, who died in 2004. Their official name is Ansar Allah, which means supporters of Allah, supporters of God. And predominantly, they were founded by a particular sect within Shia Islam. Again, Sunni, most Muslims in the world are Sunni. Around 80 to 85% of Muslims in the world are Sunni, around 15% Shia. They have ideological differences and different traditions based around back to the period of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and who should have been the continuation from the Prophet Muhammad. The idea of the Shias, it should have been blood related, that the next leader of the Islamic faith should have been passed down through the family of Muhammad. Sunnis believe that it should be essentially according to a great figure who is deserving of the role, and essentially this is in a very simple fashion, a cause of dispute between Sunni and Shia. They all, again, Sunni and Shia very much believe in the same God, very much all Muslims, but they have largely political differences today between them. And I will say that in a larger sense, the Shia world tends to follow, again, the idea of a supreme leader. And so the idea of Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran trying to galvanize the Shia and follow a certain leadership is very, very appealing to the Shia in a way that is very different to the Sunni. So we haven't spoken about the Iranians, but I'll come to them in just a moment. But let's come back to this. Let's come back to the Houthi. The Houthi is a particular sect within Shia called the Zaidi, who are found predominantly in Yemen, and they essentially came into being as an organization, a local organization of Zaidi Shia Muslims in Yemen, who were opposed to the dictatorship of Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was the dictator in Yemen. They were opposed very much an anti-corruption movement, opposed to the dictatorship in Yemen. After the Arab Spring, they were part of the Arab Spring. They then reconvened or almost compromised to an extent with the previous leader, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Ultimately, they seized control of huge swathes of Yemen. Understanding Yemen's population, Yemen is 65% Sunni. So the Shia are a minority in Yemen, but the Houthis today are not the official recognized government of Yemen, but they control around 80% of the population of Yemen. So they're a non-government actor who were previously, for example, and we'll speak about problematically, recognized as a terror organization by the Americans, then taken off the terror list, potentially being put back on the terror list. But essentially, they're a non-state organization who claim to be the legitimate representatives or leadership of Yemen. They control significant swathes of Yemen, including the capital Sana'a. So the government of Yemen today is currently ruling in exile within Yemen from Aden, essentially. But so the Houthis are incredibly powerful organization within Yemen. Since 2015, approximately 2015, they've been in war with a Saudi-led coalition. Again, remember, Sunni, Shia, all gets very complicated. And Yemen is incredibly poor. The areas controlled by the Houthis have a huge amount of starvation, poverty. We understand also elements of significant creation of social castes and even slavery within these areas. And this is the Houthis. Why is it relevant right now? We haven't yet spoken, or we spoke in the previous session more about the Iranians. So if we look at the map over here of Iran, if you remember, and for those that joined me in the last session, we were speaking about that the Muslim world can be divided up into different groups. There are those that are allied with the Saudi, predominantly Sunni Saudi bloc, those that are allied with Iran, and those that are to an extent in the middle. So for example, Qatar, which is actually so small you can't really see it over here, but Qatar over here, okay, shares economic interests with Iran. They share a gas field. They also have an American army base on Qatar. So Qatar are playing both sides. They're also hosting the leadership of Hamas, and whether they will remain there in the long term, we don't know. But we have essentially Iran, which is positioning itself Again, those that are familiar with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and then those that have been following along with the protests around the world, some of those that have been most standing up against the anti-Israel protests have been Iranians opposed to the regime. And this idea that much of what has been going on is rooted with the Iranians. The Iranians essentially have been training Hamas, training Hezbollah. They've been supporting Assad in Syria. If we go across to Iraq, it's Shia militias attacking American forces in Iraq, backed by Iran. And it's the Iranians that have been arming, training, and backing the Houthis in Yemen. So essentially a Shia axis. So when we're speaking, for example, before about the Abraham Accords and Israel coming closer to various Gulf states, and even the potential rapprochement with the Saudis prior to October the 7th, it has as much to do with much of the Arab world, Sunni Arab Muslim world fear of the Iranians as it has to do with shifting values and turning towards the West as well. And so why are the Houthis getting involved? Well, I'll show you a picture. This is Abdul Malik al-Houthi. So this is one of the main leaders of the Houthis, and this is at one of the rallies. They had over 1 million people in a rally, in an anti-Western rally over the last week. And again, on the flag, I don't have it here to show you, but on the flag of the Houthis, it says, "God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse on the Jews, victory to Islam." So this is the dedicated, so just again, death to God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse on the Jews, victory to Islam. So this is the ideology of the Houthi. So if you're asking, why are the Houthi getting involved? Well, on a very local level, because attacking Israel, attacking Western interests is part of the theological, ideological backbone of the Houthis. But if you zoom out and ask, where are they getting the financial and technological backing and training, military training, in order to actually be carrying out what they're doing, then ultimately we're going back to Iran. And without going deeply into it now, when we're talking about resolving the situation, because again, on October the 7th, or immediately after October the 7th, the first time I ran a session with some of you, we were talking about, I called it Israel, Hamas, and the bigger picture. And when we think now, and again, for those of you that cast your mind back and were living at times of major wars in the world, that world wars and major wars, regional wars, don't all begin on the same day. If you go back to World War II, the United States and the UK, in the United Kingdom, the World War begins in 1939, in September of 1939. I would imagine for the Americans, to an extent, maybe you would date the beginning of World War II to Pearl Harbor, when we enter the war and when different organizations get involved. What began with Hamas has spread to the Hezbollah. It's now spread to Yemen. We've now had, following attacks on American vessels, we've had American-led and UK and a coalition of powers attacking Houthi targets inside Yemen. It's possible, and again, it's conjecture from me, but we're seeing what began as an Israeli-Palestinian issue very, very quickly become regional, and we're now seeing forces potentially drawing in powers from outside the Middle East as well. Whether we're potentially seeing a development or the early stages of what's going to be another world war, I'm not suggesting, I'm not making these grandiose claims. But again, it's with retrospect, when we look back at history, we can dissect, when did things get bigger? When did things happen? And if we look at what's going on right now, over the last 100 days, you can see various stages of change. That for those people, for example, out marching on the street about ceasefire now, and I won't go into rights and wrongs. The one thing I will say is that the idea of ceasefire now, again, and Hassan Nasrallah came out today and said, the reason everyone's getting involved is because Israel is attacking Palestinians in Gaza. This idea that if Israel pulls out of Gaza tomorrow and Hamas remain in control, then that will be the end of everything. No more Houthi attacks, no more Hezbollah attacks. I think that my perspective is, and I think most international strategists would suggest that that's a little naive, and that this is Nasrallah's perspective and narrative of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, but that things are much, much more complicated. That anyone that is trying to look at what's going on between Israel and Hezbollah and isolate it and not consider Iran, or to look at what's going on with the Houthis and not consider the United States, or consider the wider conflagration of the West, of clash of civilizations to an extent between not Islam, but Islamists and the West, is not necessarily seeing the bigger picture of what's going on. And I will say that when the United States and the Allied forces attacked targets inside Yemen, the Houthi targets inside Yemen, they attacked army bases, naval radar stations. On the one hand, they stated that they have no wish for a war with Iran. Certainly not right now. And that was statements that were made by America and its allies. At the same time, America attacking the Houthis is not an attack on the Houthis, I would suggest. That it was a warning to Iran. Don't make this bigger than it already is. And ultimately, the country with the foot on the pedal and a lot of what is going on right now is Iran. If Iran takes the foot off the pedal, then Hezbollah pull back. Same with the Houthis. If they put their pedal down, things can change for Israel and the region much, much, much more quickly. Talking about the wider world, I'm going to speak the last thing that I'm going to speak about in the last, I'm going to give myself just 5 or 6 more minutes, and then we're going to stop for questions, because a lot of you asked about the International Court of Justice. So first of all, very, very quickly, let's put up a nice picture behind us. There you go, we'll put the South Africans there. So we understand that this week, South Africa have taken Israel to the International Court of Justice and charged Israel with breaching the 1948 Genocide Convention. The idea that Israel is committing a genocide against Palestinians, that it has intent to destroy in whole or in part the Palestinian people, essentially. First of all, why did South Africa do this? So we could zoom out and suggest that, and again, I'm not an expert on South African politics. I follow to an extent. I visited, and I love very much the country. So it's heartbreaking to see what's going on. And I have friends there also. But South Africa as a country is in a terrible state. The economy is falling apart. It's become a net importer rather than exporter of food and basic foodstuffs. The economy is tumbling. There is mass unemployment, mass inflation. Crime is on unprecedented levels. The amount of murders is spiraling out of control. It's possible that the African National Congress, the party founded by Nelson Mandela, may potentially lose control at the next elections. There are parts of South Africa that don't have electricity and internet at certain parts of the day in order that they can have electricity at other times of the day. It's in a very difficult state. And so one suggestion is, again, I think the phrase is bread and entertainment, that in order to divert attention away from what's going on in South Africa, it's possible that South Africa has decided to take the action that it has. Certainly politically, certainly over the last number of years, South Africa does not define Hamas as a terror organization. I can tell you that in December, a delegation of senior Hamas officials visited South Africa. They were at a memorial to Nelson Mandela. They visited the South African Parliament and met with senior African National Congress officials. And there are a number of people in South Africa also who don't view Israel positively, because there was a time that Israel was one of the last countries to disavow or to step away from the apartheid regime, which is certainly not a good thing. But it does mean that Israel is viewed negatively by a number of people in South Africa as well. So this is the situation, that we have political ties with the Hamas, significant political ties, and ideologically connecting with the Palestinians. Again, we can zoom out further and again speak also about sort of modern neo-Marxist ideologies of oppressed and oppressors, and the powerful and the powerless, and essentially this idea of Black South Africans and Palestinians against a powerful white Israel. According to this narrative, it all fits very much together. Either way, South Africa has taken Israel to the International Court of Justice and charged Israel with breaching the 1948 Genocide Convention. What needs to be proven essentially is that Israel has an intent, in whole or in part, to destroy the Palestinian people. What is the evidence? So the evidence presented by the South Africans was, first of all, based on the significant damage, both physically and the large death toll that we spoke about earlier on. And again, we have vastly different narratives, because the idea that there is a huge number of people that have died and is unconscionable. But the idea that the difference between war and genocide is to an extent, what is the difference between a war and a genocide? Is every war a genocide? Did the Allied forces commit genocide against Germany because it killed lots of Germans in World War II, for example? Would that be today considered some kind of genocide because of the large number of people? So one argument is the significant death toll on part of the Palestinians in Gaza. The other is that by Israel informing the Palestinian population that it needed to move from the north of Gaza to the south of Gaza, it was an attempt to ethnically cleanse or to push the Palestinian population from the areas that it was living in. And there's an idea that Israel was moving the population with a view to moving them permanently off the land. And another example would be, for example, flyering. So before Israel would enter, and also right now, that before Israel enters into an area of combat, that it telephones, sends messages, flyers to tell Palestinians move out of the area that is going to be attacked. The South African presentation suggested that this was an attempt to ethnically cleanse Palestinians. We'll speak about the Israeli response in a few moments' time. Probably the most damaging part of the Palestinian presentation related to statements made by Israeli ministers. So first of all, Benjamin Netanyahu, who used the term Amalek, which is sort of a nation viewed as a mortal enemy of the Jewish people historically, and also Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, who used the term Chayot Adam, or human animals. Now, contextually, both Netanyahu afterwards and Gallant, but also even at the time, Hebrew speakers understanding and watching what was going on understood that the reference was specifically to Hamas and not to all Palestinian people. I should also mention that statements made by Israel's President Herzog, that they are also an indication of Israel's wish to commit genocide. But more damagingly were statements made by other officials. So people like Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's heritage minister, Amichai Eliyahu, was asked whether putting a nuclear bomb on Gaza would be a possibility. And he didn't discount, he said it's one option. He didn't discount it. Now, I should mention that every Israeli minister who made statements like these was condemned, was removed from position or removed from a position that they could have any influence, and that all of the people that said these things were not any members of the war cabinet and have absolutely no influence on the conduct of the war, not members of the IDF and not members of the war cabinet I mentioned before, of Eisenkot, Gantz, Netanyahu. They have no influence on this cabinet. Nonetheless, when members of parliament from the ruling coalition make statements like this, often they are said in Hebrew for political reasons inside Israel, But of course, everyone has Google Translate. Today, it's possible to translate everything. There is a wish to. And again, one of the arguments inside Israel, again, I was asked before about the popularity of Netanyahu, is that he didn't come down strongly enough on those that made such statements. He removed them from any position of power, but didn't fire them completely because of his own narrow political survival and coalition survival. And that these were the phrases that were used by the South African delegation to suggest that Israel is committing genocide. What was Israel's defense? So Israel's defense was, one, that the comments were taken out of context. Two, that those comments that would be on the pale were sanctioned and cast off in the moment, and that the people that said them have absolutely no impact on any policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. That Israel requesting Palestinians, giving Palestinians 3 weeks to move from the north to the south, flyering, informing where attacks will be taking place, is not a sign of ethnic cleansing, but it's actually a sign of moral warfare, essentially trying to limit civilian casualties by telling people not to be in a place where fighting will take place. Now, there was a senior American official that made a very similar point. He said, we, as the Americans, we wouldn't do that. Even we wouldn't do that. But again, so Israel says it's absurd to suggest that this is a sign of ethnic cleansing. This was a sign of morality, essentially trying to limit civilian casualties by giving them the ability to move out of the way, because Hamas is deliberately fighting inside civilian areas. And the other defense of Israel is procedural, that before bringing a case to the International Criminal Court, that the side proposing the motion needs to first of all put the idea to the offending side, and there needs to be a period where the offending side is able to react, to mediate and change behavior essentially before arriving to the court. And so one claim of Israel is also very much procedural, which is that the South Africans gave very little notice to Israel and didn't respond to any mediation before immediately bringing it for political reasons to the court. So this is Israel's response. I should also mention that Germany, which is very interesting, that Germany have said that when the court will reconvene for open session, that Germany will join the case on the side of Israel, and the Germany is accusing the South African. Very interesting wording. The Germany said that we, who know what a genocide is, are angered by the weaponizing, essentially, of the Genocide Convention for political reasons. This idea that essentially that if this will be followed through with, if Israel will be considered genocide, committer of genocide, that no country will be able to fight back against an attacking party when a third party gets involved in this way. So this is the situation. What could the repercussions be? And I'll finish with this. What could the repercussions be? So again, we're now waiting to see what will happen. The judges are a mixture of, but we mentioned an Israeli judge, a South African judge. Interestingly, by the way, the South African judge, there was a case around a year and a half ago of ANC parliamentarians in South Africa singing songs about killing Boer farmers, and the same judge for the South Africans said that this was not a sign of genocide, and yet the same judge was part of the case suggesting that statements made by Israeli ministers is genocidal. So interestingly, what could the repercussions be? Well, one repercussion could be potentially that the case will not go forward. It's possible. Even if that's the case, this is a huge reputational blow to Israel. The idea that Israel would even be considered to be committing a genocide is something that will be potentially very damaging for Israel in the long term. The worst case scenario is that the court will decide that Israel is a committer of genocide, right? And if this will be done, there is an idea of essentially a cease and desist order, sort of an imposition that Israel will be going against the court if it doesn't immediately cease its military action against Hamas. This would be the worst case scenario, because essentially it would be enabling Hamas to win the war, having started the war on October the 7th and remain in control of Gaza. from what I understand, listening to different international law advisors, that possibly the most likely would be some kind of limited verdict where Israel will be told it needs to commit to supplying a minimum amount of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Either way, the problem here is far more essentially reputational than it is in terms of, in the short term, actually stopping what's happening. One of the things that I've heard is that surely it's better for the Palestinians to be taking action through the legal mechanisms rather than militarily. Although, again, in this instance, the legal action is being taken by a third party, supported by the Palestinian Authority and, of course, Hamas. And in the meantime, Hamas is continuing to fire rockets and hold Israeli hostages inside Gaza. It's a very difficult situation. There's a lot more to speak about, but I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to invite questions. Again, we could go on for hours and hours. If you remember, that's what we did last time. But I'm going to stop there after an hour and 20 minutes and open it up for questions. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the questions. Okay, one of the questions was regarding, or one of the it's a statement question. One of the questions was regarding one of those on Israel's defense team, a British lawyer, Professor Shaw, essentially saying that there's no proof of intent. Again, the South Africans, and I alluded to it, the South Africans have suggested that statements made by Israeli politicians are proof of intent. What Israel's defense and Professor Shaw's defense is that the more forthright statements that were made by ministers that have absolutely no ability to impact on Israeli policy, and that the Israeli politicians and military spokespeople or leaders that are involved in orchestrating the conduct of the war between Israel and Hamas have repeatedly stated that their aim is to deal with Hamas and not the innocent population of Gaza, that they have no wish to displace them, and so on and so forth. So Israel's position is that the statements that were put forward by the South Africans of those ministers outside of the power circle are essentially not relevant, have been overemphasized, and that the statements that were made by people such as Netanyahu, Gallant, and Israel's president have been misconstrued and have been chosen selectively without choosing many other statements also made by the same figures who have specifically stated that Israel is seeking to limit civilian casualties and avoid in any way anything connected to accusations of genocide. Again, what will happen in the court, we don't know. There are international law experts who have cast out of hand the idea that Israel is responsible for genocide, but there are also international law experts in other places that have suggested that it is. Again, if you open up Al Jazeera, you will have a very different commentary on what is going on in Gaza than if you open up Yediot Achronot, an Israeli newspaper. If you open up BBC, you're going to see a very different commentary to Fox News, and so on and so forth. Yes, so for example, Keith mentioned that I mentioned the Amalek comment. Keith says that it was pointed out that the same paragraph made clear that Hamas was the target. Again, this was Israel's argument, is that the statements made by members of Israel's war cabinet were taken out of context, and that when the full sentence or the next sentence was put in place, it's very clear that Israel is not only not has the intent of genocide, but is deliberately seeking to avoid civilian casualties according to the Israeli perspective. But this was not what the South Africans put forward. Okay, many American TV commentaries use the term Palestine in talking about the current conflict. Please comment about this. There are Palestinians, but the world narrative now consider that they live in Palestine. Okay, so I'll just say a few words. If I just show you a map for just a few moments. I'm right now showing you a map of Israel, and that's the big question. So for some people, they would argue that they would say this is Israel. This is the Gaza Strip. This is the West Bank. And that will be the end of the sentence. For others, they would say that this is not the West Bank, which is a name given by the Jordanians to the area when in 1949 they occupied, 1950 annexed the area, made it part of Jordan, but Jordan on the west bank of the Jordan River, which runs down here. They will say it's not West Bank. They will say it's Judea and Samaria, which is the biblical names for the area. The idea that all of this area is part of the biblical land of Israel and should be part of the state of Israel. There are others that would say this is not West Bank, it's not Judea and Samaria, it's occupied territories. So Israel is, the argument being, the narrative being that Israel is illegally occupying this area, having taken it from the Jordanians in 1967, although that's often not discussed, the fact that the Jordanians themselves illegally occupied and annexed the area 1949, 1950. For others, this is Palestine, and this is Palestine. For others, this is Palestine. So depending on who you speak to, you will have a different meanings behind the same terms. So for example, Israel has a population of 10 million people. Just over 20% of the population of Israel are Arab, predominantly Muslim. Before if we go back to the Ottoman period, Arabs living in this piece of land when there was no Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Gaza, no nothing, that Arabs living in this area wouldn't have defined themselves at that time as Palestinian Arabs. The geographic area over here became known as Palestine. So if we move forward to the late Ottoman British Mandate period, this area, this whole area was British Mandate Palestine, and people didn't call themselves Palestinian, but you were a Jew, a Palestinian Jew, or a Palestinian Christian. You were a Jew of Palestine, a Christian of Palestine, a Muslim of Palestine, a Bedouin of Palestine, etc. After 1948, when Israel comes into existence, and the white that we see here is the internationally recognized boundaries of the state of Israel, today 2 million Arabs live within this area and are citizens of the state of Israel. Now, for some, they will define themselves as Arab Israelis. Others will define themselves perhaps as Druze Israelis or Bedouin Israelis. Others will call themselves Palestinians with Israeli citizenship or Palestinian citizens of Israel. So depending on your ideology and your narrative, there are different names. Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, or Palestinians living in other countries, will often describe Arabs, Israelis living in this area as 1948 Palestinians. This idea that they are part of the same people, but they split off in 1948. So again, when we're speaking about occupation, for example, and those that have been following on with people marching through the streets, you should be very attuned to the language, because if we're speaking about occupation, we could be speaking about occupation of Gaza since 1967, after taking it from the Egyptians, who themselves illegally occupied the area in 1948. And we could be talking about Israeli occupation of the West Bank when Israel took the area from the Jordanians, who themselves had occupied and annexed it in 49, 1950. But you could also be talking about occupation since 1948, that for many people, when they use the term occupation, they're talking about Israel's very existence, and that essentially Israel exists on Palestine. And so when you hear the terms from the river to the sea, which is actually from an Arab phrase, from the water to the water, Palestine will be Arab, and it doesn't rhyme that well. So when it's translated to English, it sounds much better. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. But essentially, it's talking about the idea that Israel's very existence since 1948 is a historic injustice, and that the only way that injustice can be rectified is or only way justice can be served is if the original injustice, the original sin, if you will, the creation of the state of Israel, is revoked. So depending on your perspective, these words are very powerful. So understanding how someone is using a word is very important. Okay, someone asked the question, is it true that this military campaign is being perpetrated by a deeply unpopular government in Jerusalem that is trying to salvage its reputation? Since the start of this conflict have shown that most of the public has lost faith in Netanyahu. Again, I'm giving you my personal opinion. Is this military campaign being perpetrated, is it being carried out by a deeply unpopular government? Yes. Whether that deeply unpopular government is carrying out the campaign with the sole intention of trying to salvage its political reputation, that's a whole other question. I would also point to the fact that those that have come into the war cabinet, Eisenkot and Gantz, for example, have gained significant political capital by virtue of the role that they played in the war, and they were not part of the government coalition prior to October the 7th. So I certainly wouldn't disagree with the idea that I would believe, and this is my opinion, that Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will hope that somehow over the course of the conduct of this war, ultimately he'll be able to salvage his political career. And I think if we look at politicians around the world, which politicians don't want to salvage their career? But even those Israelis who feel very resentful against the government, both for October the 7th and conduct since, the vast majority of Israelis still see the war as necessary. So I think it's important to make that distinction. I hope I answered the question. I was asked the question, do I think that Yair Lapid was right to stay outside the war cabinet? So for those that don't know, one of the parties in Israel's parliament is called Yesh Atid, or There Is a Future, and the leader of the party, his name is Yair Lapid, and he made the decision not to enter the war cabinet. Why did he make the decision not to enter the war cabinet? Various reasons. It's certainly likely for political reasons that he didn't necessarily want to be part of a war that could potentially salvage the reputation of the prime minister. Certainly potentially part of it. I would also argue that potentially didn't want to be in a position where he would need to go along with policy that he didn't agree with and then step outside of the cabinet. So I think only Yair Lapid can decide whether, for moral conscious reasons, he decided not to enter the cabinet, and whether Lapid will be in a better position for having not involved himself in the war. I think it remains to be seen. What we can say is that Benny Gantz has placed himself inside the war cabinet and seemingly has become a lot more popular because of it. So perhaps it wasn't necessarily the right reason. That said, bear in mind that Benny Gantz is a former chief of staff. Gadi Eisenkot, who also entered the war cabinet from the centrist parties, is a former chief of staff. Yair Lapid doesn't have that military background, so there's also reasons perhaps why he wouldn't necessarily want to enter as well. More questions. How much does the Israeli public see or know about the dire situation in Gaza? According to Haaretz, they're not seeing this. Yes. So first of all, the average Israeli, if it's possible to say the average Israeli, the average Israeli does not see through the Israeli, unless they step outside of the Israeli press, doesn't see a great deal of the physical impact of the war on Palestinians in Gaza. That's true. They don't. There are many Israelis that do see it. There are many Israelis that read, for example, Haaretz and more left-wing press in Israel. There are many Israelis who have a multitude of different opinions and ideas and are aware of what's going on. But if it's possible to say an average Shmo or an average person, then certainly through the Israeli press, there isn't it's referred to, but pictorially it's certainly not shown a great deal. Speaking of learning lessons, because Israel is a democracy and an open society, do I believe that one day it will have to ask itself whether it acted appropriately in the heat of its anger and sorrow after October the 7th? First of all, I think that there are people in Israel that are already asking those questions. And I think that certainly in the months and years to come, these will be huge questions, both in terms of Israel's failures in the war, but also I think with hindsight and when the political figures that are directly involved in the war will be away from government, I think that there will absolutely be discussions on what has taken place. Yes. If the IDF is unable to fully defeat Hamas, what do I think the consequence for Israel will be? Okay, so this is a very good question. First of all, I think the question is also, what is victory? Is victory Israel militarily defeating Hamas? Or is victory Hamas surrendering and returning hostages? I think that it's again, that in very simple terms, if Hamas will remain in a position where they are able to threaten Israel militarily, if the Palestinians, regardless or otherwise, will be actively attacking Israelis militarily, I think it will be a huge failure for the government of Israel, and it will be very difficult. And I also think this also about Hezbollah. If this all finishes with the inability of northern people living in the north of Israel to go back to their homes, it's not something that I think that Israeli society can contemplate. If those people go back to their homes and Hezbollah still have a military ability in the short term to attack them, it's unacceptable. So I think anything less than a restoration of safety and security to Israeli civilians is going to be seen as a failure, and more so if it finishes with essentially a clear failure for Israel, and Israel not being able to complete its aims. And again, I would suggest that if Israel is unable to fully defeat Hamas, it will be because it's been constrained. Whether that's constrained by its allies or whether it's been constrained by the United Nations or by the International Criminal Court. If IDF will not have been able to defeat Hamas because Israel is not able to enact its sovereignty fully, and that will be very problematic, I think, also ideologically, in terms of being able to guarantee the safety and security of its citizens. So I dread to think what the consequence will be if Hamas will remain in power in Gaza, both for Israelis and for Palestinians. Because if Hamas remain in power and Palestinians, no one is going to want to be involved in reconstructing the Strip. No one is going to want to invest in the Palestinians and improve the standard of their life and improve their lot. So it will be a catastrophe for both Israelis and Palestinians if Hamas will remain in control. I was asked the question if there will be a link to the recording after the session. So yes, I will get the session uploaded online, and you'll be able to share it with anyone that you'd like to share it to, or anything you'd like. How do I see the intervention of Germany in the ICJ proceedings? First of all, I can tell you, and this is also my feeling personally, that I think Israelis have been very heartened by Germany's response over the course of the last 100 days. That there were very strong German responses in condemning Hamas, the actions of Hamas, and emphasizing the legitimacy of Israel to safeguard the security of its citizens. And the statement, again, whatever one feels, the statement of Germany with its history to state that not only is it standing against South Africa, but is doing so because of the weight of its own history, is a major statement. And again, with Israelis looking around the world and seeing a lot of condemnation, and a lot of Israeli Jews and Jews in the world perceiving a lot of the anger towards Israel to be framed through either neo-Marxist anti-colonialism and misunderstanding of what Jews are and what Israel is, or anti-Semitism, it's heartening for Israelis, and it's something that's been played up in the press in Israel when certain countries are making moral statements. I should mention, by the way, that I read today that Namibia has come out very strongly against Germany for backing Israel at the International Criminal Court, because Namibia holds Germany responsible for the killing of tens of thousands of Namibians. So that's interesting as well. Is Hezbollah's presence breaching the 2006 ceasefire terms? Does that undermine Israel trust in UNIFIL and therefore international bodies more generally? Okay, so we did speak about, so first of all, is Hezbollah's presence, if we remember that map I showed you before, is Hezbollah's presence here in contravention of the 2006 ceasefire terms? Yes, absolutely. So does that undermine Israel's trust in UNIFIL, United Nations? Yes. Is that the only thing that undermines Israel's trust in the United Nations? No. And by the way, this is also why many Israelis are worried about what will happen at the ICJ and in the criminal court, because many Israelis see the international institutions as rotten and politicized, essentially. In the case of the United Nations, much more than UNIFIL, worries about UNIFIL, there's a great deal of consternation regarding, first of all, what Israelis perceive to be the role of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is tasked with responsibility for looking after Palestinian refugees. First of all, because the definition of a refugee, according to UNRWA, is different to any other refugee population in the world, which is why Palestinian refugees are not only those that were refugees from the War of 48 / independence / Nakba catastrophe, but the children of, or patrilineally, refugee status can be passed down ad infinitum from Palestinian father to son to father to son, and so on and so forth. So today there are upwards of 7 million Palestinian refugees from a refugee population of approximately 750,000 in 1948. So one Israeli perspective is that, and I mentioned before, up to around 100,000, for example, Palestinians living in Lebanon without any citizenship. Those are descendants of Palestinian refugees from 1948 who fled to Lebanon, remained there, and have been overseen by UNRWA and not given the rights and privileges of Lebanese citizenship since 1948, meaning young children born in Lebanon today, Palestinian refugee camps, which are now slum cities in Lebanon, are still refugees from the conflict of 1948. So Israelis are, first of all, they see this is very problematic. And then on a local level, the actions of UNRWA, both before October the 7th, from an Israeli perspective, in the incitement taught in UNRWA schools, the complicity, as it's seen in Israel, with the extensive tunnels and the use of hospitals and terrorist infrastructure inside civilian areas that were used by the United Nations, UNRWA, inside Gaza, is something that Israelis, for the most part, have a major issue with. And the conduct of the United Nations since October the 7th in various statements that have been made and various statements that have not been made have also undermined the standing of United Nations even further. Okay, have the Druze from northern Israel moved from their homes? Okay, so the Druze living in the north of Israel have, first of all, most of the Druze in the north of Israel are not living in areas completely adjacent to the border. So most of the Druze are not living in areas that are being required to move from their homes. For those that don't know, Druze is a separate ethnic and religious group that exists particularly in Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. They're an offshoot of Shia Islam in Egypt in the 11th century, but a completely separate, independent religious and ethnic group. You're only Druze if your mother and father are Druze. And the Druze see themselves as a distinct nation, completely separate. They're a monotheistic religion. Their main prophet is Jethro, who was the father-in-law of Moses. And one of the unique things about the Druze is that they see themselves as a nation, but they do not have as part of their religion a wish for an independent Druze homeland, but rather they are bound to be loyal to the regime in which they live. So the Druze in Israel are very, very patriotic for Israel. The Druze in Lebanon for Lebanon, the Druze in Syria for Syria. Interestingly, by the way, the Druze in the Golan Heights traditionally avoided taking Israeli citizenship, partly because they didn't want to have problems regarding continuing links with their family in Syria, but also because of the problematic nature of the Golan Heights being Syria up until 1967, and how they should see themselves, whether they should see themselves as Israeli or Syrian. Following the Syrian war from 2011, we've seen significant numbers of Druze in the Golan Heights, in much higher numbers, adopting Israeli citizenship, and a number also now fighting in the Israeli armed forces, which is very interesting. For the most part, for the few Druze that would be living in areas that would want to move, part of the Druze faith and culture is to be steadfastly connected to the land on which they live. So the Druze, if anyone will leave the land, the last to leave the land would be the Druze. I will say that the Druze during, some of you are aware that I mentioned before, Arabs living inside Israel. So one of the accusations about Israel is Israel is an apartheid state. Again, we can speak about the problematic nature for the Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Gaza is occupied or not since 2005 and the Israeli withdrawal, and again, the nature of Israeli control of certain parts of the West Bank, all of the West Bank, and again, whilst it may not be apartheid, whether there are various things that are problematic, the Arabs living inside Israel have full citizenship and rights. At the same time, they're often perceived very often to be second-class citizens or seen in a different way. And one of the problematic laws that was passed in 2018 was called the nation-state law. Now, the nation-state law didn't change anything, but it had great power emotively, because the nation-state law essentially wrote down in law what everyone knew, but now it's written down, is that Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people. And this idea in some way that it puts those who are not Jewish sort of slightly outside the box, so to speak, with regard to the Israeli populace. One of the things that's been happening even during the last 100 days, and there was protest about it, and many Israelis across the religious and political spectrum have an issue with this as well. But there've been a lot of speaking, even during the war, about changing the nation-state law to incorporate the Druze into the nation-state law, because people are seeing just how much of a sacrifice the Druze are making for the country over the course of the conduct of the last 100 days. What, if any, form of credible pressure has been exerted by United Nations, international community, Arab world, or any other on Hamas to cease fire? First of all, I will say, for everything that we know, there are far more things that we don't know. So there are many things that are going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. Ultimately, and again, I've spoken to people in the know, the majority of the countries aligned with the Abraham countries in Saudi Arabia essentially would like to see Israel achieve its aims for this war. Regardless of what is said, in order to placate the population or not to cause rifts within the Arab world, that essentially it's in the interests of the leaderships of the moderate countries within the Arab world for Hamas to cease to be a military threat to Israel. Now, whether that's a surrender or a military defeat is another matter. Again, I can say from my perspective, in an ideal world, Hamas will wave the white flag, give back the hostages, and that's the end of that with that regard. Although, with reference to the Iranians, we understand this is much bigger than just Hamas. But that's also why the Arab world would like to see Hamas vanquished, because essentially any situation which sees Hamas essentially remain in power is a victory for Iran in the wider geopolitical wranglings between the Sunni and the Shia world. So I don't necessarily think the pressure is being exerted on Hamas, because, again, ideologically, the Hamas leadership are not necessarily interested in, they don't come from the same Western logical position that we are coming from, and it's not in their Iranian interest for Hamas to surrender. So I think there is very little pressure that can be applied to Hamas, unless that pressure is to give up in order to be given the ability to have safe passage and live out their lives in exile. But I think the vast majority of the Hamas leadership ideologically are not necessarily interested in living in a villa in Saudi Arabia in peace. It's not necessarily what they're about. How do we get the information to pro-Palestinian sympathizers that Jews lived in the Middle East countries long before any Muslims or Arabs were there? They were abused, murdered, and thrown out by Muslims. My husband's parents among them. Should Jews demand compensation from Muslim countries? Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, should Jews demand compensation from Muslim countries? I'm going to start at the end. There are those that say there is a huge focus on the idea of the Palestinians and their right of return, but what about all of the Jews all around the world, including much of the Arab world? Again, we spoke about 750,000 Palestinian refugees in 1948. Approximately 800,000 Jews became refugees from Arab and North African countries, which is why there are virtually no Jews across the Middle East today. So there are those that are advocating and speaking about the Jews should demand property and compensation and so on and so forth. I think one of the reasons that there is not a louder argument for this is because there are many in Israel that see the idea of the Palestinian demand for a right of return to either their homes or the homes of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers from before 1948, that they see this as something which is aimed at undermining, or if it happened, Israel would cease to exist. And therefore, the answer to that is not to ask for the same thing, because it would undermine the ability to argue against the Palestinian right of return. So I think that's one reason why we don't hear a lot more about it, although the reality is that there is a good reason why there are practically no Jewish refugees there are no Jewish refugees from 1948, and there are 7 million Palestinians, when there were 2 equivalent sized populations of refugees approximately in the same era. How do you get information to pro-Palestinian sympathizers? I think there is a difference between a pro-Palestinian sympathizer in the term that was, in the way that the question was asked, and anti-Israel. So I think the idea of being empathetic to the situation of the Palestinians since October 7th, and empathetic to the trauma, the national trauma of Palestinians, and the life that Palestinians lead, regardless of whether that responsibility lays directly at Israel or the Palestinian leadership or the Arab world. But to be empathetic and to be pro-Palestinian is not a negative thing in my mind. That's the first. I think it's important to say. That's why, for example, for me, when I look at a lot of the protests going along around the world, I find it very difficult to call them pro-Palestinian protests. From my point of view, I don't call them pro-Palestinian protests. I think they're much more anti-Israel protests than they're pro-Palestinian, because I think from my mind at least, and again, one can break me down, but since Hamas are an autocratic, virulently racist, illiberal, corrupt dictatorship in Gaza, and since the Fatah in the West Bank are also corrupt and uncaring about the Palestinian people, that someone who is pro-Palestinian would wish to see an improvement in the conditions of the Palestinian, and surely that would see the birth and sort of the removal of a leadership, from a yoke upon the Palestinians, which pushes them down and doesn't enable them to flourish, and would be pro the creation of a self-Palestinian leadership that would be looking forward to try and create a Palestinian state that will flourish. That would be, for me, pro-Palestinian. So when I will see people marching around pro-Hamas or people pro-Houthi, after everything we spoke about with the Houthis, it seems absurd. The idea, for example, of claiming the Houthis are an anti-colonialist movement when they literally curse the Jews on their flag is insane. And I think anyone that wants to find that information will find that information. So I think that on the one hand, you have people that are genuinely pro-Palestinian, and we're all tribal to an extent. We're all biased, and so it's understandable why, especially if one is Palestinian or Arab or Muslim, that one will feel closeness to. So I understand. I think with regard to the question about denial of Jews living in the Middle East, or the idea that Jews are all white and they should all go back to Europe, I think that is something much deeper, because I think it comes much, much more from a place of ideology and narrative. When you are fueled by ideology and narrative, it's very difficult to accept facts that contradict your worldview, even when they're in front of your face. So again, if we're looking at this neo-Marxist way of looking at the world, and again, for those in the States, there's been a huge amount of coverage about it on campuses across the United States. When you have a worldview that divides the world into the powerful and the powerless, the colonized and the colonizer, the enfranchised and the disenfranchised, the privileged and the devoid of privilege, and essentially puts everyone in boxes, fixes where people are, has a hierarchy of privilege, and suggests that those with no privilege, according to this hierarchy, are also devoid of agency and responsibility, you have a huge issue. And Jews don't fit easily into that box. And I'll say also something a little maybe controversial, that I can also understand why so many people will declaredly call themselves anti-racist, but then be anti-Semitic. And I understand it in a way, I'm not excusing it, because generally racism is understood, if we're going on this idea of hierarchy of privilege, racism is generally often assumed that it's belittling someone. You're worse than me, you're weaker than me, you're less important than me, you are less valuable than me, etc., etc. And Jewish people don't really fit into that box, because on the one hand, Jews have been the victims, are the poster boys and girls and people for persecution through the ages. On the other hand, today in many places in the world, Jews are extremely successful and well integrated into societies. And so where do you put Jews on the scale? If you go to the United States, where the experience of race and as a social construct is generally putting people into color categories, where do you put Jews? A Jew for Hitler was anything but white. But if you put a Jew in the room with a KKK member, then he's not going to be accepted as a white supremacist. But on the other hand, Jews on campuses in the United States are seen as the epitome of white privilege. So where does the Jew fit in? If you look at the way that anti-Semitism is expressed, then anti-Semitism tends to be expressed as the Jews are controlling the money, or the Jews are in power, or Jews are setting the narrative in Hollywood, and essentially, Jews were both the communists and the capitalists. The way that anti-Semitism expressed is very conspiratorial. It's always that the Jews are sneaky and clever, strong, inadvertently sort of excessively powerful, behind the scenes, etc., etc. So when racism is expressed in a way that is different to the way that pretty much every other racism is expressed, you're dirty, you're horrible, you're stupid, you're idiotic, and it's terrible. The Jews don't really fit in to the nice, neat boxes that this hierarchy of privilege and race is arranged itself. And so Jews need to be white. The idea that when you come to Israel and see that the majority of Jews in Israel are brown and black, in American terms of race, it doesn't work. So it's not true. But again, if you've got people that are still denying that anyone was raped on October the 7th, or suggesting that actually it was Israel that mowed down with Apache helicopters all of the people that were partying at the Nova party on October 7th, when all that stuff is on video, and half the stuff was recorded by Hamas themselves on GoPros and put on Telegram channels by Hamas, when you've got people that are denying that stuff, the idea that people will deny that all Jews are white Europeans and Israel's a settler colonial state, that it's not going to change. What I will say is that, and my perspective is that those people that are saying, sort of regurgitating this idea, Jews are white, Jews are foreign, they're not supposed to be there, they've all got second passports, they should all go home, is completely misunderstanding the nature of Zionism, the nature of this irrevocable connection between the Jews and the land of Israel, and defining themselves as a people and a wish and a right to self-identify as a people and constitute themselves as a nation in what Jews define as their homeland. So the more that narrative keeps being pushed, and the more that Palestinians are emboldened by, I would imagine if I am a Palestinian and I will see millions and millions and millions and millions of people all around the world marching all over the world saying exactly that, it would embolden me not to abandon that narrative. That eventually we'll keep knocking on the door and keep knocking, and eventually the Jews will go home. Except most Jews in Israel have nowhere to go and don't have no intention of going anywhere, and so we're not going to solve it. Which I guess almost comes back to the question before: is what happens if Hamas win? And I think the answer is they can't. Israel can't let Hamas win, because if they do, then it will embolden those that will suggest that eventually, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, Israel won't be here anymore. Which is not a narrative that will lead to reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians and some kind of compromise that will lead to a state for both Jews and Palestinians in the region. So I hope that answered the question in some way. Has any consideration been given to the idea of offering incentives to Gaza civilians, healthcare distribution, food, water, to support a demilitarized state? All these ideas are out there, but I would argue that we're not there. There's a very, very, very well-known video blogger, Arab Israeli video blogger. You might be able to work out who it is. And one of the things that he said was essentially talking about this idea of sort of negotiation. He said, and this Western idea that you should just negotiate. You should negotiate, and if you show people that they're going to have more healthcare and more medicine and better jobs and better education, then things will change. Again, it's also, by the way, an Israeli conception as well. The former president of Israel, Shimon Peres, he also had this idea that if we can raise the economic levels for Israelis and Palestinians, then we'll create a new reality. That who would want to go and blow themselves up when they can see a future for themselves, to bastardize his point. And what this particular person said, which really resonated with me, was you can't start to talk about healthcare distribution, food, water, and all of those things to someone who's completely radicalized. He said, first of all, you need to de-radicalize. And in his words, he said, if you have millions of Palestinians who have been brought up in Gaza by an autocratic, Islamist, virulently anti-Semitic organization, who have been taught unimaginable hate from a very young age in schools, you need to find some kind of way of de-radicalizing before you can have that conversation. So I would love to be in a situation. First of all, I would love to be in a utopian world where a Palestinian state wouldn't need to be demilitarized because the Palestinians would not have no intent on attacking anyone. But we're not there. Hopefully, we'll get there. Yeah, both Germany and Japan were demilitarized after World War II, and it took a long time for change. So that's one of the things that's been mentioned. Okay, one of the questions is perhaps the whole of Israel-Palestine needs an international peacekeeping force in order to lead to a two-state solution. I don't think anyone in Israel-Palestine is interested in an international force coming in. Israelis aren't interested in internationals coming into Israel. and why would any sovereign state that already exists be interested in international forces coming in? And also, Israel does not trust, and we were speaking before about the United Nations. I think that the idea of an Arab coalition coming into Gaza and West Bank and being part of a remodeling of Palestinian society would probably be more attractive to Israel than an UN coalition, would be my feeling. Okay, I was asked what degree of support or opposition is there in Israel to a two-state solution? I can tell you that before October the 7th, so I've been a guide and educator for many years, and we used to talk a lot about the two-state solution. And I would say from 2007, 2008, no one really spoke about it. It wasn't that anyone was for it or against it. It just wasn't really spoken about. Everyone just spoke about conflict management. A lot of Palestinians that I will speak to will say, what's the point in discussing a two-state solution because we don't have a leadership that could run a state? And Israelis would say, well, how can we talk about a two-state solution when there's no partner on the other side, or the other side is rejected over and over and over again? So what I will say is that on the one hand, I think October the 7th has pushed everybody away from a two-state solution. I would say that if you ask Israelis today, you will find a minority of Israelis will be for a two-state solution. And that's certainly the case for the Palestinians, as it was before October the 7th. I think that Palestinian anger at the situation in Gaza and Israeli settler activity in the West Bank, especially over the last year, I think has made a lot of Palestinians not willing to even countenance the idea of sitting and talking with Israel, and Israelis are certainly not trusting of Palestinians in any way, shape, or form. So I think that it's not realistic right now, with the two populations as they are, the trauma of the two populations post-October 7th, and with the leadership of the two populations. You may call me naive, but I also believe on the one hand that everything that's happened has pushed two-state solution further and further away. But on the flip side, perhaps shown that in the long term, anything but a two-state solution can't work. Israel's conception up until October 7th that it could sort of mow the lawn every so often or keep the conflict on a low flame and just live with the conflict. Like if not too many people are getting hit by rockets every so often and not too many people are dying and there's not too many terror attacks, then Israel can just live with it and not solve it one way or the other. That's been completely that's been completely destroyed, that whole conception. And a one-state solution is not something that, if I'm talking for Israelis, that is something that either Israelis or Palestinians could see themselves living with. So I would think on the one hand, October 7th has pushed a two-state solution, and the aftermath has pushed a two-state solution further away, but I would also argue perhaps it's shown that ultimately it's probably never been more necessary. So again, we spoke before about de-radicalization and new organizations. Something has to change. Okay, I was asked the question, will you comment on the settlers, their attacks on their Arab neighbors, and where they would figure in a two-state solution? So I'll say a few words about this. And again, this is my opinion, and it's important to stress this. I'm going to sort of set aside sort of violent behavior of settlers in the West Bank and relate specifically to how things would look in a two-state solution. And again, this is all kind of, I mean, I'd love it to be relevant, but it's largely, you know, pie in the sky because a two-state solution is not on the table at the moment. But ultimately, whenever a two-state solution was put on the table, a two-state solution always involved a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank. So the idea is that the 1967, so that the green line, i.e. the 1967 line, would be the basis for a Palestinian state. Now, today there are upwards of 500,000 or more Israelis, mostly Jewish, but not only, living in various towns and villages inside the West Bank. which are, though often they're called settlers, they're known as settlements. And so the argument is what happens with those people. So I will answer the question by telling you a conversation that I had with Saeb Erekat, who was the former Secretary General of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, who I was fortunate enough to meet with a group in his office in Jericho in 2019. And we sat in his office, and he was the Secretary General of the Palestinian PLO. He was the chief negotiator of the Palestinians at Oslo. And someone in the group I was with from Columbia University asked him, how do we get to a two-state solution? He said, it's easy. He said, if the Israelis will want it, we can do it tomorrow. He says, very, very simple. First of all, the borders will be based on the Green Line. So the West Bank will become, and the Gaza Strip will become Palestine. Again, he didn't speak about a tunnel or a bridge, but the idea is that that will be the Palestinian state, he says. And the capital of the Palestinian state will be East Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be divided between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And so we've dealt with Jerusalem, we've dealt with borders. He says, and now settlers. He says, settlements are very problematic, but they are not insurmountable barrier to peace. He says, all the settlements that are close to the Green Line will redraw the line and incorporate those settlements into Israel, so that they won't be West Bank anymore. They'll stay where they are. The settlements will remain, but they'll now be in Israel. And we'll take bits of Israel and put them into the West Bank. We'll do 100% land swap. And that way, there won't be 500,000 Israeli settlers anymore in the West Bank. There'll be a few tens of thousands in isolated settlements inside. They will all need to leave. He said, like the 21 settlements left, where Israel pulled out 21 settlements from Gaza in 2005. So he said, so essentially, most settlers can stay where they are. We'll redraw the line. He said, the Green Line, it's not holy. It's not in the Bible. It's not in the Quran. It was a temporary ceasefire line from 1949, but it is important because it's facts on the ground. But essentially, bits of the West Bank will go to Israel and bits of Israel will go to the West Bank, and all of the other settlers will have to leave. And that was that. So in my mind, I sat there listening very patiently, and I thought to myself, I think there's a lot of sense in what he's saying. I could argue, in theory, shouldn't Jewish Israeli settlers be allowed, in theory, to remain in Palestine and become a Jewish minority in a Palestinian state, like an Arab minority in a Jewish state? But ultimately, neither here, neither there. So he turned around and said, so I've shown you that a two-state solution is possible. So I sat there and I thought to myself, I don't know if I should say something. I'm the tour guide and I'm on his turf, and I have to be very careful to be not sort of take one side or another. But I said, but I can't not ask the question. So I said, Mr. Erekat, first of all, thank you so much. It really heartens me to hear what you say as an important member of the PLO and the Secretary General and an Oslo negotiator, because essentially, as an Israeli who's a strong advocate for a two-state solution, you haven't gone into detail, but you've acknowledged the idea that Jerusalem can be divided. You've acknowledged the idea of the Green Line as a basis for two states. You've largely dealt with large settlement blocks and shown that settlements are a problem, but not an insurmountable barrier to peace. So you've essentially shown that you're prepared to make a lot of compromise. But there's one thing you didn't speak about, which is the Palestinian right of return. And that a core part of Palestinian identity is that every single Palestinian who is defined as a refugee, not only those that left, but the children of children of children, those that are in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan, and 1.8 million that are now in Gaza today, 80% of the population of Gaza, that as part of any two-state solution, they will be able to live and become citizens of Israel alongside a Palestinian state. And I said to him, and if 7 million Palestinians will become citizens of Israel alongside those Palestinians that are in a Palestinian state, Israel will cease to exist in its current nature, and essentially it will either become one state, or there will be two Palestinian states. So if you've gone so far, you've solved borders, you've solved Jerusalem, you've solved settlers, you've shown that it's possible. How do we get over the final hurdle? And his response was, I can't decide for the Palestinian people whether to give up on the Palestinian right of return or not. Next question. And that was that. So I was very disheartened back in 2019, because I sat there as an Israeli and said, well, to divide Jerusalem, you need Israelis and Palestinians to both compromise. To change borders, you need both Israelis and Palestinians to compromise. And in doing so, and to uproot settlements and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the Palestinian refugee issue, only the Palestinians can decide whether to compromise on that. And ultimately, if every Palestinian defined as a refugee by UNRWA becomes a citizen of Israel, that's something Israel could never countenance. But if Palestinians will only accept a state on the basis that that happens, then there will never be a Palestinian state. So I think that, coming back to the question, that the behavior of the settlers, which in my mind, and again, it's not all the settlers, but the behavior of those radical settlers who are violently attacking Arabs is unacceptable, I think, and that if the government needs to take every legal action against those that behave in such an abominable way. But I will separate that off from a two-state solution, because I think that ultimately, as Saeb Erekat showed, I don't believe that settlers are the biggest barrier to a two-state solution. And again, if we look in the context of Hamas and October the 7th, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005. It's often spoken about a blockade on Gaza, but the blockade in Gaza didn't begin in 2005. The blockade in Gaza only began after the Hamas seized control of Gaza in 2007. So the blockade was placed on Gaza because of a radical terrorist organization that took control of the Gaza Strip. And again, we saw what happened ultimately on October the 7th. But the possibility of Gaza to choose a different path it didn't need to go this way. And I think ultimately, again, and not to absolve Israel of much of the responsibility for the Palestinians, but again, I think it also comes back to what we were speaking about before with regard to the hierarchy of privilege, that when one has no power, one is not responsible for one's own fate, is a guarantee that one's fate will never improve. That ultimately it's possible to be a victim and also to work to improve one's own situation. So I think that for there to be a two-state solution, it needs to be an active choice of the Palestinians to want a Palestinian state more than they want Israel to cease to exist, which I think is the feeling of a lot of Israelis, that it's more important for many Palestinians for Israel not to exist than it is for the Palestinians to have a state. Okay, I was asked, saying that I didn't talk specifically about the situation in Jenin and Nablus, and can I comment about the PA's effective loss of political control there and the IDF and settler response? So Jenin and Nablus are major cities in the West Bank. They're Area A, nominally under Palestinian Authority control. But the situation, first of all, I will say that one of the things you will often hear is, why is Israel's military active in the West Bank when there's no Hamas in the West Bank? And that's not true. So there is Hamas in the West Bank. And as we mentioned before, Hamas has a huge support in the West Bank. The difference is that in the Gaza Strip, Hamas is in control and there is no other control. And in the West Bank, first of all, there is Israeli military presence, and there are in Area C and in the area of Jewish Israeli settlements, which it has a massive impact, because it's much harder for terrorist actions to be carried out when there is Israeli military presence. Whether it should be there or not is another matter. The other thing is that because the Palestinian Authority has certain places that it is very weak. So for example, in Jenin and Nablus, which were the cities that were mentioned, and in those cities, there are terrorist attacks emanating from them, plans for terrorist attacks which are being, they're being stopped, which is why if you've heard of assassinations and you've heard of arrests taking place in those areas, and even in one instance, a rocket attack, it was specifically on Hamas targets inside the West Bank. And this is also part of the difficult situation, because these organizations are able to grow in those places because of enmity and hatred of the Palestinian Authority. At the same time, the Palestinian Authority, in order to maintain control, needs to have at least some coordination with the Israeli security infrastructure. And that coordination with the Israeli security infrastructure makes it even easier to paint the Palestinian Authority as traitors to the Palestinian cause. So in order for the the Palestinian Authority, to keep political control, they need support from Israel. But support from Israel paints them even more as unrepresentative of the Palestinian people, which is a catch-22, which is one of the reasons, as we spoke about at the very beginning, why the Palestinian Authority, even if it wanted to come out strongly to condemn Hamas, it would not be politically prudent for them to do so, because to do so would be to utterly lose the respect of anyone on the street in the West Bank and Gaza. I was asked a question about what percentage of electricity, power, and water is Israel actually responsible for providing to Gaza? So this is a really complicated question, because it also relates to the question of whether Gaza, prior to October the 7th, was occupied. Because there are some that argue that despite the fact that Israel withdrew completely from the Gaza Strip in 2005, that because it maintained control of Gaza's sea and airspace, that it remained in occupation of the country. According to certain aspects of international law, it would appear that that argument is a little frivolous, especially with relation to the fact that Israel utterly and completely withdrew, and also that Gaza has another border with another country, which is Egypt. If one is occupying an area, then one is responsible for its electricity, power, and water. If one is not occupying an area, then one is not responsible for its electricity, power, and water. So one of the arguments after October the 7th, when Israel said we're going to close the access to these things, one of the legal arguments was, well, actually, Israel is not legally required to supply electricity and water to Gaza because Gaza is not occupied. For those that argue that Israel is responsible, therefore it was considered to be collective punishment. So again, it comes back to interpretations of international law. One of the problems in Gaza is that the electricity production and water in Gaza was also damaged by the Hamas themselves. But there's one particularly beautiful video where Hamas shows itself digging up water pipes. I think many of them were donated by the European Union, actually, but digging up water pipes and refashioning them into weapons, into rockets. So and Hamas also has caused huge damage to the main aquifer under the Gaza Strip. It's polluted it with sewage. So one of the reasons that Hamas is also in a difficult situation is because of the lack of responsibility that Hamas has taken as well. So depending on one's narrative, either Hamas is responsible or Israel is responsible. But ultimately, it's a matter of it's a question of interpretation of international law and of narrative. I was asked why Israel took its eye off the ball on October the 7th. That's the million-dollar question. Thank you so much to those of you who are still with me. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope it was useful and informative, and hoping for better times ahead. In the meantime, if you're still confused, like me, hopefully you're even more aware of how complex and nuanced and complicated. The fact that things are nuanced, complicated, and complex doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about them. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have an opinion, but we should also embrace the fact there are things that we don't know. And when someone asked the question before about when people are marching, we should tell them this and tell them that. I think that this is the biggest gift that you can do with anyone is rather not to try and if you have a conversation with someone who doesn't understand things or has very strong opinions not based on knowledge, the best thing you can do is to ask them questions. Because the best way to show someone what they don't know is not to tell them that they're wrong, especially when their whole worldview is their opinions are based on a worldview that they have. Because no one likes to understand and see that their worldview is wrong or being challenged. But I think the best way to chip away at all of us is to ask us questions. And when we have a question that we can't answer, or a question that we can only answer in a way that contradicts something else that we think, that's when we start to challenge preconceptions and start to make people understand for themselves that things are more complicated. I think that's the best way to have discussions about everything going on.